Now, before we continue, there are two key terms that are imperative if one is to understand um, the role of women in warfare, for that matter, the role of women in history. The first of these is gender, and gender essentially refers to socially constructed roles for men and for women, the ways in which men and women are expected to behave, and the power relationships between the two. Uh, and and both men and women can be sort of imprisoned within these roles. In fact, society has picked out the roles that men and women are supposed to play. Men are supposed to be tough, boys don't cry, this kind of a thing. Women are supposed to be soft, nurturing, this kind of thing. Once upon a time, the expectation was for women who could afford to be, who were middle class and could afford not to work a job, were supposed to be housewives. And if they went to college, they were going to college to get their MRS degree, so-called, to find a husband. And because these roles are socially constructed, they change over time. Now, there's one caveat I want to make about gender before I go on, which is that once upon a time, we thought of male and female as being distinct sexes, and therefore there were gender roles assigned to males and gender roles assigned to females, and these socially constructed roles could change, but they changed within the framework of males and females. Nowadays, our ideas of gender are much more complex than that. I have a friend who thinks of herself as being non-binary. In fact, she doesn't like thinking of herself as herself. That's really not the way she refers. The pronoun that she prefers is themselves, which takes some getting used to for me. But it's important for me to respect her identity, even though it's a learning process for me. By some accounts, there are as many as 52 identifiable genders at this point. But to keep things simple, we're going to keep it down to two. Now, the second key term is patriarchy. And patriarchy is a system of social structures and practices in which men govern, oppress, and exploit women. And the funny thing about this kind of exploitation is that it's the only kind of exploitation in which the exploiter loves the exploited, and that's one of the things that makes patriarchy almost invisible, because as Gerda Lerner mentioned previously, it almost seems to be hardwired into the human experience. So that unlike slavery and other forms of oppression, it took a long time for it to become clear to women that their relationship with men was so unequal as to be, in effect, oppressive. And indeed, a component of the feminist study of patriarchy has been the concept of, quote, male privilege. And that's the system of advantages or rights that are available to men solely on the basis of their sex. A list of these advantages would be almost limitless. But one of them would be the idea that men can normally walk at night without having to worry about being attacked. If you are a male student and you're walking across the Oval or down in Mirror Lake Hollow or whatever at night, you don't have to worry about being attacked or kidnapped or raped or that kind of a thing. It's not that it couldn't happen to you; it's that you don't have to worry about it as a matter of routine. Female students do. In 1988, Peggy McIntosh, a scholar in women's studies who was white, adapted the idea of male privilege to race. She stopped to think of herself, well, I know that as a woman, there's such a thing as male privilege. Let me think about that in connection with race privilege. I'm a white person. What unearned advantages do I have that persons of color do not. And she came up with a list of over 40 unearned advantages that she, as a white person, possessed. And indeed, she tended to forget about these advantages because she took them so much for granted that she had to write them down and carry them around with her. This is where the term white privilege originated, and it's kind of unfortunate that it has escaped its original academic environment, because once it's gotten out to the open, it has gotten into a realm where people think of privilege as something different. People think of privilege as sort of like being wealthy and having a great big backyard that sits out on a beautiful lake or river or ocean, and you have butlers coming down with platters of hors d'oeuvres and martinis and that kind of a thing. And that's not the privilege in the respect that we're talking about at all. I can elaborate on this, but unfortunately, we kind of need to move on. But just by way of setting a period to this, white privilege does not mean what in common discourse we have come to think of as being privilege. It's a different animal altogether, and it's unfortunate we can't find a better term to express what we're really talking about. Now, a basic question of women's history is simply this: where are the women and what are they doing? For a long time, when we thought about women, they were essentially invisible. If a woman was a ruler, Elizabeth I of England, Catherine the Great of Russia, and so on. If it was a woman who had a role to play that had formal power like that of a man, then that woman was visible. But ordinary women were invisible. They simply were just not part of history, not part of the equation. They were invisible. And so, again, the basic question that women's history asks, first of all, is where are the women and what are they doing in any historical situation? This engraving by the French artist Jacques Callot, who during the 30 Years' War made a well-known series of 18 engravings called The Miseries of War. In this instance, when you're looking at this particular engraving, the question can be answered literally. Where are the women and what are they doing? Well, in the left lower portion of the engraving, here is one woman, and here is what she is doing, or more precisely, what is being done to her. She's being grabbed by one of the marauders and probably about to be raped, murdered, or both. And being victims is not just something that happened to women during war. Men and boys were also victims. But victimhood is perhaps the stereotypical role that comes most readily to mind when thinking about women and warfare. This romanticized painting of the murder of Jane McCrae illustrates the point. Now, Jane McCrae was killed early in the Saratoga campaign during the War of American Independence. And the account of her death that circulated immediately after it happened is that she was murdered and scalped by Native Americans allied with the British. And this story spread like wildfire along the frontier of upstate New York and helped to inflame the passions of Americans against the British, as well as their Native American allies. And this account is the one that is portrayed in this painting by John Vanderlyn. It was made in 1804. Now, the version that it depicts is inaccurate. The actual story is somewhat different. I won't get into it. It does involve her Jane McCrae's death. It does involve the fact that she was scalped. It occurred under different circumstances. The fact of the matter is, she was actually shot by an American party pursuing a Native American group that had sort of kidnapped Jane McCrae and was making off with her. Um, Once she was shot, she fell to the ground, and at that point, when she was dead, the Native Americans scalped her. So it was a pretty gruesome event, no matter how you cut it. But this image here of this sort of beautiful, innocent, woman is a kind of a classical version of woman as victim. And here is another. And this image is familiar to us, although the label, beautiful soul, may be new. In this kind of symbolism, men are construed as violent, women as peaceful. Men are protective of women, and women symbolize what is good and best about a society, all that is worth protecting. One of the worst things that could be said about the enemy, and frequently was said, was that the enemy was intended upon abducting and raping one's women. Early in the American Civil War, in fact, a Confederate general assured his soldiers in a proclamation that the enemy's watchword was beauty and booty. So, soldiers, watch out for the Yankees coming because they're coming to get your women. By the early 20th century, mass advertising had made this kind of threat vivid and visual, and with a touch of titillation as well, as shown in this U.S. propaganda poster from 1917. A third stereotype regarding women and war is that of the instigator. This 1863 cartoon in a Northern News Weekly shows, quote, Southern women hounding their men on to rebellion. The implication being that women exploit the importance that men attach to being manly, and that perhaps the worst way to attack a man is to condemn him as a coward if he does not go on to war. In Great Britain, at the start of the First World War, British women placed white feathers in the lapels of civilian men they encountered, the white feather being a well-known symbol of cowardice. This British cartoon shows a group of women who have cornered a man in civilian clothing and are saying, "You coward, why don't you enlist?" And this really happened, and the recollections of male victims unwillingly placed in the quote unquote order of the white feather suggest that they continued to feel this stain upon their honor well into old age. A fourth notorious stereotype is that of the prostitute who services soldiers. The stereotype is undeserved because many women did not at all fulfill this kind of role, but prostitutes during wartime did, of course, find many customers among soldiers taken from their communities from months or years on end, and who utilized the services that these prostitutes, or to put it in a neutral term, these sex workers provided. This was a role recognized in armies, some of which, like the French army in World War I, established medically supervised brothels, medically supervised in an attempt to limit the spread of venereal disease. During the American Civil War, prostitutes were examined by Union physicians and issued licenses to quote unquote public women so that they could quote pursue their avocation. During World War II, some women were actually forced into sexual slavery, most notoriously by the Japanese army, who forced hundreds of Korean women to serve as so-called comfort women.